the Honorable Prime Minister, Professor Maitri, Excellencies, distinguished guests, Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen. The great Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends to justice. So it's a special privilege for us at the Deakin Law School to host this Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Dr. Ranil Wickramesinghe, who indeed has taken Sri Lanka toward the arc of justice, pursuing a policy of peace and reconciliation, rather than victor's justice, retribution, and punishment, and transforming a society that is plural, diverse, into one that is based on the rule of law, founded on peace, and embarking on a period of prosperity. So, Honorable Prime Minister, thank you so much for that wonderful oration that was glittering for its erudition and for the time and effort you expended in building this relationship with us at Deakin Law School. Thank you very much indeed. Those amongst us who are of Sri Lankan origin or are familiar with Sri Lankan history will know that it is particularly fitting that this talk or oration on freedom of navigation is given by the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. Because Sri Lanka has a glorious past as a maritime nation. If you delve back in the mists of time, the Prince Vijaya is said to have traveled from the region of Kalinga in the eastern part of Sri Lanka around the 3rd century BC to establish the first kingdom on that island and lay the foundations for what today is Sri Lanka. Legend has it that the prince was, along with about 500 or 700 of his followers, had his head half-shaved and was put on board a ship by his father, the king Simhabahu, to be sent into exile because of his horrible, violent deeds, because the population was apparently clamoring for his head to gain justice for these violent deeds, and to never see him again, the king set him on board the ship. Fortunately, the 700 followers, the prince, and their wives and followers all ended up in Sri Lanka, and today we have this oration thanks to those foundations. As far back as the 3rd century BC, there are reports of a flourishing maritime trade between Sri Lanka and the many kingdoms around Kalinga. There are art objects which depict elephants on board ships with people, suggesting, and there are accounts which corroborate this, of a trade between Kalinga and that region and Sri Lanka in elephants. And it is said that elephants from Sri Lanka were particularly feral in war and prized as a result in conflict. And there are legends about Sri Lankan elephants ending up in Hannibal's army. Whether this is legend or truth, one does not know. But there is enough proof of a robust trade between India, especially its eastern seaboard, and Sri Lanka that go back at least to the 3rd century BC in elephants, in precious stones, silver, pearls, etc. There are also accounts of Sri Lankan kings on expeditions as far a sea as Myanmar. And these accounts all show a Sri Lanka that was very engaged in the Indian Ocean trade, conquest, conflict management. There are accounts of Sri Lankan kings who've sent emissaries to the southern part of India to intercede in politics in these kingdoms to stave off conflict from afar, so that the conflict actually does not end up on the shores of Sri Lanka. Very smart diplomacy, if one might say so. The accounts of Chinese travelers such as Xuanzang, Fa Xian, Marco Polo, etc., all corroborate many accounts of trade between Sri Lanka and the surrounding region, all the way into the 1st millennium. But for some reason, that trade fell away, and with the advent of European colonial influences in the 16th century, the indigenous trade almost came to a standstill, and Indian Ocean became a playground for the colonizers. Since then, with the Cold War and the post-World War II UN architecture, the Indian Ocean kind of receded from prominence as an area of geopolitics, whilst other lands and seas became prominent in geopolitical affairs. That has radically changed today, as the Honorable Prime Minister's very erudite lecture indicated. The Indian Ocean region now is a geopolitical theater for conflict and competition between two dyads of states. The first dyad is US and China, and the second is India and China. These two dyads are engaged in constant competition for control, primacy of this region, simply because a third of the world's population is based within the 38 or so countries that call the Indian Ocean region their home. To add to the mix, of the 38 countries, you can name a few select ones, such as Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, etc., Iran, that are home to conflict, internal disturbances, ethnic and other internal disturbances that have global ramifications, all of which create a unique cocktail which makes the Indian Ocean region perhaps the most significant geopolitical theater of our times, and one where the risks are so magnified and so unpredictable that they demand attention from us in a way that's perhaps never been the case in history. For that reason alone, the Prime Minister's address today, in its erudition and detail, which of course we expect from any Deakin graduate, which he recently has become, is of historic significance. And the significance of the region is also embodied in tangible measure by the kind of expenditure that the navies of these surrounding states have undertaken in the last couple of decades. The Indian Navy alone, by 2025, is said to have 162 warships in this region, 2 of which at least will be aircraft carriers, multiple submarines with nuclear and conventional capability. The Chinese Navy, of course, is substantially geared up, and in just about 10 to 15 years will be on par with the US. Even navies as far afield as South Africa and Australia have undertaken massive investments in modernization, simply on account of this dyadic competition, and primarily because of the Chinese perceived threat. What does all of this have to do with law, lawyers, or Deakin Law School? Why is law or lawyers, or why are lawyers necessary to understand, manage this kind of conflict and competition? Now, my friends in the business school might be tempted, and they often say this, quote the most famous lines from Henry VI, from Shakespeare's work, which says, "First, let's kill all the lawyers." And that is usually their default position for any number of complaints. And on occasion, I and my colleague Mike Ewing agree with that view. But that would be a mistake in this context, because as the Prime Minister correctly said, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the work product of many lawyers over many decades, has provided a framework for cooperation and conflict management that has survived several decades and several very protracted, deep animosities that has resulted in many wars, for example, between India and Pakistan. Without UNCLOS, instances such as the Mumbai terror attacks in 2008, which had a maritime origin, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the terrorist group that sent the terrorists, originated by sea from Pakistan, evaded the Indian Navy's attention, and ended up carrying out the terrorist strikes. There are many other such instances which, but for the framework and the legalized method of managing conflict between states that are deeply engaged in animosities, would have probably culminated in much more violent and bloody conflicts than have actually transpired. It is the work of lawyers and the law that results in a stable but challenging equilibrium that provides a way forward through improvement, through amendment, through the code of conduct that the Prime Minister suggested, that ultimately will result in a better world for us. That better world is no longer a luxury even for those who believe that navigation, maritime law, admiralty, etc. is too boring or something that we don't care about. As the Vice-Chancellor also correctly said, the blue economy is not just about ships or boats or pirates or such exotic things. The cables that bring the internet to our doorsteps, to our tablets, through our phones, all depends on this blue economy to have safe navigation, to have the ability for commercial parties to invest without conflict, etc. And all of that depends on the free seas, navigation, the ability to use the global commons without creating a tragedy of the commons. And that tragedy of the commons ultimately will be averted by the work of law, legal institutions, and lawyers. I wish to end with a quote, again from Shakespeare, and this is from Julius Caesar with Brutus speaking to Cassius. And I'll explain the significance of why this matters. I quote, "There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound on shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea we are now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures." This statement by Brutus to Cassius at a very opportune moment in the war against Octavian is kind of like the situation that Sri Lanka and indeed Deakin are on at the moment. We have an opportunity to take the tide and seize a fortune, or we can stand on the sidelines and end up in shallows and in miseries. Sri Lanka is on the cusp of enormous change and prosperity after having emerged from a violent conflict that was very protracted and costly. Deakin University is on an upward tide, having leaped the rankings by a few hundred places, making innovative discoveries, changing the way in which the young people of the world will be educated, and fortunately is situated within the same Indian Ocean region that Sri Lanka occupies, with the bounty of the demography of the youngest minds from 2 or 3 of the largest populations in the world. So together, Sri Lanka, Deakin, and indeed Australia have this unique opportunity to take the tide and make our fortune. And as the Prime Minister indicated, through the open challenge of creating this code, ensuring peace for this region, and promoting prosperity for our people, in which both Deakin and Sri Lanka can partner, we are all likely to inherit a better world and leave one that is even better for the next generations of people. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance at this event. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our events team, the Faculty of Business and Law's staff who are present in numbers here, the many guests from the profession, the judiciary, industry who have all attended, the staff of the university's events and engagement team, our students who have come in significant numbers, the Prime Minister's delegation for making all of this happen, the Prime Minister's office, Sandra and her office who have made a lot of this happen, the High Commissioner's office, which has also assisted and enabled the visit, my colleague Atula Pathinayaka, who was instrumental in setting up this visit and making it a reality, and indeed all of you for being such a wonderful audience. I wish you a good evening, and I hope that you will be a partner with Deakin University in this journey to make this region a better place for all of us. Thank you very much indeed.